Okay, I guess we're going to start. Okay, excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm Roger Waldinger. I'm professor of sociology, director of the Center for the Study of International Migration at UCLA, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's book talk. This is part of an ongoing series that we have run since the beginning of the academic year with our friends and colleagues at the University of San Diego, the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies. Every Friday, we meet from 12 to roughly 1:30 to discuss a new exciting book on a migration topic, and we will continue to do so for the rest of the spring quarter. That means we have another 3 sessions, and next Friday we'll assemble here at the same time to discuss a very interesting book entitled Adventure Capital, Migration and the Making of an African Hub in Paris by Julie Kleinman, an anthropologist, with a comment by Laurie Hart from the UCLA Department of Anthropology. But today we're going to focus on a place a little closer to Los Angeles, namely Maricopa County, and we're going to hear about a very interesting new book, Driving While Brown, Sheriff Joe Arpaio versus the Latino Resistance. And to tell us about this book are the 2 authors, Terry Greene Sterling and Jude Joffe-Block. So they will talk to us for roughly 20-25 minutes, and their presentation will be followed by a comment by Professor Amada of the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. The baton will go back to Terry and Jude for a brief response, and then we will open up for discussion with the audience. You can send me questions in the chat, you can raise your hand, and we should have a lot of material for lively back and forth. So without further ado, Terry and Jude, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, we're going to start with a multimedia presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. Oops. On it.
Hi there. I'm Terry Greene Sterling. So nice to be with you today. Thank you for joining us. A little bit about what brought me to writing this book. I was born into an Arizona-Sonora borderlands family, and I have for many years written about the people, places, and politics of this region. I have interviewed and written about Arizona's notorious Sheriff Joe Arpaio for newspapers and magazines for many years. Also, I interviewed him for a previous book, and now for this book. I'm happy to share my thoughts and insights and experiences based on those years of reporting with you.
And hello, thanks for being here. I'm Jude Joffe-Block, and I started covering former Sheriff Arpaio in 2012. Back then, I was a public radio reporter. And our book draws on about 30 interviews that we did with Arpaio over the years, as well as interviews with about 100 others who opposed him, supported him, or factored into this history in some other way. And there were also thousands of pages of records that we consulted for this book. As a journalist, I won't be sharing my opinions today, but I will be sharing reporting and analysis. And we are going to launch into our presentation.
So what's this book about? This is a book about a powerful local sheriff known throughout the world for his immigration crackdowns. Because he is known to sometimes retaliate against his critics, few in Arizona have the courage to stand up to him. The system of checks and balances breaks down. So what happens is a fearless Latino resistance rises up against Arpaio, as well as these new laws in Arizona that are designed to criminalize and deport immigrants. This is a book about a battle for America, really, at a different level. It's a book about a battle for America at a time of unconstitutional policing, reckoning, and demographic change.
And we titled this book Driving While Brown because of the history of people of Mexican descent in Arizona feeling targeted by immigration-themed traffic stops. And Danny Ortega, who's featured in this book, he was born in this country and explained to us how some of the earlier patterns of crackdowns against unauthorized immigrants also felt like an attack on him too, even though he's a US citizen. He was a young man in the 1970s when the Peoria Police Department outside of Phoenix began targeting farm workers in traffic stops to check their papers. And let's listen to Danny.
People were being stopped because they were brown, driving while brown, okay? And so we saw this not only as an attack on the undocumented community, but we saw it as an attack on us simply because of the features of our skin and our hair color and our language.
Let's turn our attention just for a second back to Joe Arpaio. Like, who is this guy? Well, he's the son of an unwanted immigrant who becomes the bane of unwanted immigrants. He spent 20 years in federal drug enforcement, and he developed in this career an interest and embracement of conspiracy theories, a skill at getting media attention. And finally, he also learns to develop characters for his fictional characters for his undercover work. He retires in Phoenix and he runs for sheriff in 1992. Here he creates a new persona for himself, and that persona is America's toughest sheriff. In the early 2000s, a movement starts building in Arizona to kind of restrict and punish unauthorized immigration from Mexico and Central America, not kind of completely restrict and punish unauthorized immigration from Mexico and Central America. Arpaio does not initially embrace that cause, but he pivots in 2006 after he sees it's popular with his white base.
And in 2007, he signs up for a federal partnership to enforce immigration laws. And in the past, only federal agents could arrest immigrants for being undocumented, because that's technically a civil violation of federal immigration law, not a criminal violation. But Arpaio sought to change how that kind of immigration enforcement could happen on the ground locally.
My program, my philosophy is a pure program. You go after illegals, I'm not afraid to say that. And you go after them and you lock them up.
And Arpaio soon starts many tactics to crack down on immigration locally. And one of them are these massive neighborhood sweeps. And his deputies would flood neighborhoods and pull over cars, and they'd arrest people who had outstanding warrants, but they would also arrest people who were suspected of being undocumented. So drivers and passengers would be arrested and then turned over to ICE for deportation. And through this tactic, Latino US citizens and legal permanent residents and other lawful immigrants also felt targeted too. And this is a scene from the documentary Two Americans, which I highly recommend. It came out in 2013, and it shows footage from a number of these sweeps. And in this scene, you'll also see some of the activists who would gather at the site of these sweeps to yell at the people who'd been arrested, to remind them to stay quiet, to ask for a lawyer, to not sign anything if they were given a chance to sign for a voluntary deportation. And so you'll meet some of the people who we write about in the book.
Solamente su nombre, no coopere, no coopere, de solamente su nombre, tiene el derecho a un abogado.
I mean, there was no reason to pull me over at all. There was no reason. I wasn't a speed. I didn't do any violation. I think it's the way I look. I look Hispanic, and I am Hispanic.
Joven, tiene el derecho a un abogado, no sea intimidado. Le van a preguntar por dónde entró, con quién entró, en dónde vive, dónde está su esposa. No conteste.
You stopped cars for having broken windshields and burnt out taillights. Explain how that is law enforcement. Explain that, Arpaio. Explain how that makes you a tough sheriff in America.
buscar trabajo, no están aquí por crímenes. Esa es mentira. Esa es una mentira muy grande.
We are under attack.
¡No firmes! ¡No firmes!
Eso es lo que quiero que sepan. Y a todas las familias que se cuiden porque esto parece un infierno. Arizona se está convirtiendo en un infierno para los hispanos.
Los van a querer intimidar. Los van a querer intimidar. Pidan por un abogado.
Sorry about that. And so those sweeps weren't the only tactic as part of this crackdown. There were also worksite raids. This is a picture of a car wash where Arpaio's deputies arrested workers who are undocumented, who didn't have lawful authorization to work in this country. They were charged with felonies and turned over to ICE for deportation. And famously, in 2009, Arpaio staged this event for the media to watch while he paraded all of the undocumented jail inmates in his jail to a segregated portion of Tent City, the outdoor jail.
So who were the people who rose up against Joe Arpaio and these immigration laws in Arizona? They are people who are indigenous, immigrants from Central America and Mexico, day laborers, Mexican Americans, older Chicanos, young Latinx activists, their allies. And in some cases, their kids. They all joined the resistance against Arpaio. One of the Latinx activists that we follow in the book is Carlos Garcia, who gained national fame for his organizing. And he told us that he spent every waking hour of his day for months and months and months, trying to figure out how to stop Joe Arpaio because he too had been an undocumented immigrant. Lydia Guzman, who is a main character in our book, and she is also the counterbalance to Joe Arpaio, and the tension between Joe Arpaio and Lydia Guzman propels us through the book. She ramps up her activism as Arpaio ramps up his enforcement. She's motivated by the terror that she sees and that you just saw a tiny bit of in the film clip from Two Americans. She takes down the names and contact information of victims and witnesses, and some of these folks later join a very famous racial profiling lawsuit against Arpaio in federal court. The case is called Melendres v. Arpaio.
And we just want to take a minute here to pause and go a little bit more in depth with some of these activists who were involved in the fight against Arpaio, because what shaped them is a really important part of the story. And so Lydia Guzman, who you just saw, this is her when she's a bit younger in the late 90s, right before she moved to Arizona with her two children who you see here. And she grew up in Southern California. She's the daughter of her mother. It came to California undocumented, but later was able to adjust status. Lydia really became politicized in her 20s in Southern California when California voters voted in favor of Proposition 187 in 1994. And that was an initiative that would restrict public benefits from unauthorized immigrants, including access to public education and some healthcare. And this moment to Lydia felt like a slap in the face. And she joined a backlash. She helped naturalize immigrants to become citizens and helped register them to vote. Many analysts credit some of that organizing that happened in the wake of Prop 187 with really changing the political landscape in California. New voters were energized, Latinos ran for public office, and now California is a very blue state with not passing the kind of legislation like Proposition 187 anymore. And then, oh, go ahead, Terry, you'll tell us about these guys.
Okay, Antonio Bustamante, you saw him yelling to Arpaio as an older guy. You saw him yelling in the film clip. What kind of guy are you, Arpaio, separating little children from their parents? Danny Ortega, you also heard on the audio for Driving While Brown, why driving while brown mattered. And in the history of Arizona, and Alfredo Gutierrez. All three of these guys became activists as college students in the 1960s and 70s as Chicanos. And they were, of course, motivated and worked with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Movement.
And we're going to just tell you a little more about Alfredo Gutierrez, who was the man with the megaphone shouting in Spanish to ask for a lawyer. So he went on to become, as a young man, he joined the Arizona State Senate, but he grew up in a mining town in Arizona. And the photo you see in black and white, this is a photo of the segregated YMCA that his father, who also grew up in the same town, Miami is the name of the town, Miami, Arizona. In 1928, this YMCA branch was only for Mexicans. You know, many of these boys were Mexican American, but they called it the Mexican YMCA, and it was separate. And the pool at the YMCA, the so-called Mexicans couldn't swim in it only one day a week, the day before the pool was drained. And Alfredo grew up, before I go on to that, his father, who's in this picture and the black and white picture, as a teenager was actually deported as part of a mass deportation in the 1930s. And he wound up coming back to Miami and raised Alfredo there. But Alfredo grew up with this idea that even being a US citizen might not protect you if there is an attack on immigrants, because his father had lived this experience. And as Alfredo was growing up in Miami, he saw the mining union really help to end segregation in the town. He as a little boy, he wound up going to a school that was integrated for the first time, and he credited that union organizing with that with those social justice reforms that he saw growing up, and brought that sensibility with him into when he went to ASU and met other Chicano activists. And so now we're going to return to the fight against Arpaio and the racial profiling battle. And so where we had left off with that was that we had told you that Lydia Guzman was helping to gather evidence for this Melendrez v. Arpaio racial profiling lawsuit. And that case went to trial in July of 2012. And the plaintiffs, who were Latino drivers and passengers in Maricopa County, they had to prove that Arpaio's tactics discriminated against them.
So you saw the clip of Arpaio talking about how he was going to round up all undocumented immigrants, and he presented there as a very fierce, tough guy. But actually in court, we watched him very carefully for a long time, and he presented himself in court as an old man who was, often bewildered and confused and couldn't hear very well. And he repeatedly denied wrongdoing.
At the end, after the trial, a federal judge found Arpaio's tactics were unconstitutional, and he ordered sweeping reforms at the agency to prevent profiling. Along the way in the litigation, Arpaio, basically in 2009, Arpaio had lost that federal partnership with ICE that we told you about when Obama came into office, his Department of Homeland Security wound up revoking that agreement. And because of that, the judge found that Arpaio no longer had the authority to arrest immigrants unless there was a criminal reason to do so, that just being undocumented wasn't enough of a reason for a local sheriff to arrest someone. That should be left to the federal agency. Now, even though the judge had told Arpaio in 2011 to stop making immigration arrests, it came out later that Arpaio's deputy, that Arpaio had ignored the order and his deputies had never been communicated this order. And the members of the Latino Resistance called for the US attorney, called for there to be criminal contempt of court charges against Arpaio because he had violated the judge's order. And this is an activist, Viridiana Hernandez. She's a dreamer, and she and others stood outside of the US attorney's office in Phoenix and called for there to be a criminal prosecution.
Arrest Arpaio. He has done enough crime. He has done enough suffering. He has done enough pain, and our community will not take it anymore.
And in the end, the Department of Justice in Washington, a different division, does decide to prosecute, but we'll hear about that later.
So in the meantime, Arpaio makes a new friend, Donald Trump. Arpaio endorses Trump very early in Trump's presidential bid, and the two have what I view as a mutual admiration society. Arpaio likes to talk about how similar he and Trump are in so many ways, and he calls Trump his hero. Trump also sees in Arpaio sort of this successful xenophobic rhetoric that really resonates with a certain part of the white voter base. And he sees how well Arpaio has used it to his political advantage. And the activists, of course, and as well as Arpaio fans, all see the similarity between Trump and Arpaio, these two very similar figures, and they call the activists, the Latino activists call Trump the national Arpaio.
And many of the activists who had been battling Arpaio for years joined together to launch a campaign called Basta Arpaio to get him out of office in 2016. And they mobilized voters of color who don't have a history of voting and who campaigns typically don't reach out to.
So it works. Finally, after 24 years in office, Arpaio loses his re-election bid for sheriff in 2016. Now many voters view him as a ruthless civil rights violator, as a symbol of white supremacy and law enforcement. And as some view him as an old man who is an expensive embarrassment to Arizona. So what all this means is the resistance has prevailed, but there is more work to be done. There always is. And the activists set their sights on Arpaio-like, Arpaio-ish policies in the jails and other discriminatory law enforcement practices on the streets. So we were talking about Arpaio disobeying the federal judge, and after a criminal trial, Arpaio is indeed found guilty of criminal contempt of court for disobeying the judge. But before Arpaio is sentenced, his friend Trump gives Arpaio his first presidential pardon.
And there's an immediate backlash to this pardon and heavy criticism of Trump's decision. And we met with Arpaio after the pardon, and he shared his reaction to that backlash.
I got two new titles now. The disgraced sheriff, that's everywhere. Disgraced sheriff. And the other one is racist. So I got two new titles. I lost my America's Toughest Sheriff title.
Now, Arpaio tried running for office again, but he was not successful. But the grassroots efforts to mobilize voters of color in Arizona continues. And this is Maria Castro. She's an activist in her 20s who she's been walking neighborhoods trying to get out the vote since she was in high school back in 2011. She told us she'd never seen voters as excited to participate as she saw in 2020. And that excitement is one factor for why Arizona turned blue in the 2020 presidential election. And she told us, I think the defeat of Joe Arpaio made it tangible that we can defeat the villains that haunt our dreams. And that concludes our presentation.
So thank you so much. We'll now turn the floor over to Amada Armenta, who will comment on the book, and then we'll segue back to Jude and Terry, and then on to questions and answers. Amada, the floor is yours.
Yes, so thanks so much for the invitation to comment on this book, which I read cover to cover, including the appendix and the notes. It really reads like a page-turning political thriller that chronicles, and it's kind of like courtroom drama, that chronicles the devolution of immigration enforcement and its really devastating consequences for Latino communities. This book chronicles two parallel stories. The first is the sort of rise of anti-immigrant populism in Arizona that we can remember from Proposition 187 in California, but there were a number of other restrictive state immigration laws that the book talks about, even before the one that I think is outside of Arizona know most about, SB 1070. So it chronicles the rise and fall of Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County, documenting how he transformed from a conservative but kind of mainstream sheriff into the anti-immigrant demagogue and notorious sheriff that I think we're all more familiar with. And at the same time, it tells the story of the rise of Latino political power in Arizona, and shows how a handful of immigrant activists and organizers were resisting Arpaio from the very beginning, through protests and through manning these hotlines where they would document the ways that the sheriff's office would arrest people and round people up through saturation patrols and worksite raids, in hopes that one day this information would be used to hold the sheriff's office to account for their racial profiling and civil rights violations. And over time, these documented stories were used in investigations and lawsuits that slowly began to chip away at the sheriff's office authority and abuses. And as these various cases were slowly grinding their way through the courts, organizers continued to rally, protest, and register voters. And as we can tell, by 2020, their movement and actions were really instrumental in turning Arizona blue in 2020, much like what happened in California as a result of Proposition 187. So this book was simultaneously very depressing and really hopeful. It was depressing because it really shows that the battle over the devolution of immigration enforcement is going to be one that is ongoing. Because as restrictionists continue to pass anti-immigrant state laws, and they do so because it's politically popular, right? A small minority of voters really want it, and it helps people win elections. And people like Chris Kobach and other people in the restrictionist movement continue innovating in creating these anti-immigrant laws that they hope will pass muster. Now, at the end, many of these laws are defeated in court, but they're still implemented, sometimes for 7 years to a decade, and their implementation has devastating effects for the communities that are most affected, and in this case, Latino immigrants and their families and citizens. So, one thing that I sort of wondered is that you know, in some ways it doesn't really matter that so many of these laws are eventually struck down, because they will just find a new way to create anti-immigrant laws that have really devastating consequences. And it reminds me of this term from a legal article written by Michael Wishney over 20 years ago. He coined the term laboratories of bigotry to describe what happens when we devolve immigration enforcement authority and allow legislators and local law enforcement officials to innovate in these ways. So we're all familiar with SB 1070 and 287G, but I was really less familiar with Arizona's SB 1372. This is this human smuggling law that passed in 2005 that made it a state felony to smuggle undocumented immigrants in Arizona. Now, in this case, Maricopa County's innovation was to allow and to prosecute undocumented immigrants on the charge of conspiring to smuggle themselves. Now, this law was immediately challenged. There was a lawsuit against it in 2006, but it wasn't blocked until 2013, right? So it was on the books for a long time, allowing the sheriff's office to continue to arrest and charge people through the statute for 8 years. So the book really shows that Arpaio delighted in illegally enforcing American immigration laws, and routinely instructed his deputies to target Latinos for traffic and pedestrian stops, to detain them for longer than is legally allowed, and to conduct these illegal worksite raids and saturation patrols. His office did a lot of other outrageous things, including destroying evidence, investigating and retaliating against political opponents, misusing public funds, like illegally confiscating things from people. This sort of depths of depravity in the sheriff's office, where I think I hadn't fully understood everything that was happening in Arizona. That being said, you know, the actions of the sheriff's office were really extreme. And one question that I have for the authors, and I think really the main question, is what might have happened if Arpaio had been less obviously racist and retaliatory? So would his actions have received such opposition if they were executed, quote, more professionally? And I asked this thinking about my own research, in which I examined the devolution of immigration enforcement authority in Tennessee. And I went back and I looked for my field notes after I read this book, because I remember this conversation that happened in a meeting between the sheriff's office in Tennessee, where they were implementing 287G, and immigrant activists. And they were arguing over the large number of people who were arrested and detained for the charge of driving without a license. And the immigrant organizers were comparing this to what was happening in Maricopa County. And the sheriff at this meeting says, "I never want to be compared to Joe Arpaio. That's not what I do. Arpaio isn't even a sheriff. He does a lot of things wrong. It's not even 287G. And the reason that I ask this question is, on the one hand, it's the way that Arpaio delighted in and how he looked for political press to show how tough he was on immigration enforcement that made him popular, but it was also ultimately his downfall. On the other hand, local law enforcement agencies can police immigration, as Monica Varsani says, through the back door in lots of ways that are entirely legal, right? So arresting people for driving without a license. In most states, undocumented immigrants are ineligible for driver's licenses. Even if undocumented immigrants are not arrested, their cars can be confiscated. They can pay enormous fines and fees, as documented in Greg Prieto's work. And police and law enforcement agencies can do all of these things legally and professionally. So one question I had was sort of, well, why did the sheriff do all of these things? He could have accomplished many of his goals in ways that were less obvious and legal if he had wanted to. And I say this thinking about the arguments that many of us have had about Donald Trump and his more incendiary policies, that if he had been more competent, he probably could have gotten more of these things through But luckily, his buffoonery sort of undermines some of his more diabolical efforts. So that's really my main question. And a couple of other questions that I'd love to hear your thoughts on are just approaching this book as journalists. You have a particular set of tools and practices that are similar yet different from a sort of standard qualitative social science methods. And Jude, I noticed when you started this talk, you said that this talk was a result of your reporting and analysis and not your opinions. And so I sort of wondered why you slipped that in, and have more questions about your own positionality when you're collecting data for this kind of long project. And then the other question that I have is that one thing that really struck me as I read this work is that you really talked about the biographies of different activists and organizers and showed that they did this work at great personal costs. It took emotional tolls, psychological tolls, health tolls, financial tolls, a toll on their relationships. And why did you think it was so important to share those intimate details and stories as well? So I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you again.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much, Amada. You've set us up terrifically for a great discussion. So back to you, Terry and Jude, and then we will turn to the audience.
Well, thank you so much for that really thoughtful read and comment. I guess to start with the question about the contrast that you brought up with Tennessee or other law enforcement agencies that can do backdoor immigration enforcement without crossing a legal line. Well, I guess one point about that is sometimes they are crossing legal lines and nobody's bringing it up or suing in court to find out where that line is. I think, but you're absolutely right that a big part of this story is that that Arpaio was so public and was making so many public comments that it did make it easier for the plaintiffs to make their case. And in fact, when Arpaio is found to have violated court orders, to not have followed the judge's order to stop making immigration arrests, the reason that was known was because Arpaio was putting out press releases, and an ACLU attorney who was part of the effort to sue Arpaio noticed on Twitter this press release that seemed to be bragging about something that was a direct violation in conflict with the court order. And so that just really encapsulates how the publicity edge, which was so important to his brand, worked against him in court. And I do think that there are other cases. I wish I knew more about it, but for example, the Justice Department brought a similar kind of case against a North Carolina sheriff, but that case actually, they did not prevail in that case. It's hard to prove some of these discriminatory policing cases, that there's really a pattern and a practice, that the bar can be very high. And in this case, I think some of Arpaio's comments and the press releases did create a bit of a paper trail that conveyed what some of the objectives of what he was doing were. I think that it is interesting to note, though, that in Arizona, there are other law enforcement agencies that are doing some of the same kind of immigration tactics, just not the flashy kind, the backdoor kind, and there's not as much attention or outrage on it. And it reminds me as well of the fact that the Obama administration deported a record number of immigrants, and a lot of the outrage about immigration policy came under Trump, and we didn't see that outrage under Obama. And what parallels with that is that Arpaio's successor, Paul Penzone, a Democrat that many people in the movement against Arpaio helped elect, many of those activists feel disappointed because Penzone has continued to allow ICE agents to pick up arrestees who are leaving the jail. And so that nexus between local law enforcement to be a dragnet for deportation continues in Maricopa County, even in spite of this see change in office. At the same time, part of SB 1070 said that Arizona can't have any sanctuary cities, and that's a nebulous term, and we can debate about what that means, but it does raise questions about what options does the sheriff have in light of that. But so that debate still continues today, and there's certainly not as much focus on it. But for those who are really adamant about wanting there to be a stop to local immigration enforcement, Penzone's administration has been a disappointment. Some of the activists we feature in the book refused to even vote in that race in 2020, even though it was a choice between Penzone and Arpaio's former chief deputy on the ballot. And I'll let Terry chime in.
Well, Jude is the expert on the legal stuff. I can talk to you a little bit if you want on about why we chose to write such intimate stories. I can't write stories. I can't write anything that isn't people-centric. I like to look at how I'm fascinated by people, and Jude is too. And we wanted, this story had been told before in bits and pieces, it had been reported on before, but what had never really been reported on before were, how activism impacts activists and activist families and what they went through and how they struggled, what their trials were and how they overcame them. That to me is in my view is the most fascinating part of the book, because it's epic. It's a beautiful story. This said, we asked very tough questions. I mean, activists and Arpaio and everybody, all of us have failings, and we have good points and bad points. So we wanted to tell the story of people as they are, because I think that's what, I think that's what readers respond to, and I think that's what will carry them. If they develop an interest in the characters, they'll get through the book. They'll read through the book. They'll want to go along on the journey with the characters. So that's why we chose to do that.
And I think also, I think it was really important to us to reveal the private cost that no one saw. Everyone can see political change, who won an election or the outcome of a court case. But when you realize that there's people who are going into debt, people who are losing their homes to foreclosure, whose partners are divorcing them because they had to put the blood, sweat, and tears to get that to happen. That for big change like this, sometimes the ACLU did come in, and Covington and Burling, a big law firm, did come in to help with that case, and that was huge. But they also needed some of this on the ground activism at the grassroots level, and it's hard to punch a clock and get paid for that and get the recognition that is deserved to do that kind of work. And so I think that for us to really understand how social change happens, we have to tell these private stories of the toll that it actually takes.
Terrific. So thank you so much. And let's begin with the Q&A. We have, I'm going to start with Professor Cecilia Menjivar. Let me give her, let her enter to ask a question. See whether this happens.
Yes.
Okay, Cecilia, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi. This is, of course, a very interesting book. You know that.
We lost you.
And it's been great. I have a question about this, as Amada mentioned, the two stories, the second story about the activism and the personal stories that you decided to tell, which are very important. One thing I wanted to know more about is whether or how you saw the support, the amazing amount of support that came from the outside. And by support, I mean organizational support for the organizing in Arizona that came from the National Day Labor Organizing Network, from Endilon specifically, because I lived in Arizona during the whole time, doing research on immigration. It just happens to be. So I remember that when I started doing research on immigration in Arizona, there were no immigrant rights organizations there. There were, I contacted everyone, and people were more interested in dealing with issues that concern all Latinos in the state. And the organizers, you focus on the Bustamante and Ortega, they were doing a lot, but they were not involved with immigrants at all. It was only in parallel fashion, maybe, with what happened with Arpaio. It was only around 2005, 2006, with the big march, that kind of a switch came on, and they started to join what some Carlos Garcia, Salvador Reza, in very close collaboration with Endilon, were actually implementing on the ground. So I wonder where you place Endilon and the support, the really critical infrastructure that they put in place for this activism to happen, actually. I actually took some of my students to interview immigrants for the case. And we got together in Tonatierra's offices with Salvador Reza, because that's the only place that was really seen to be dynamic and interested at that time. So so I wanted to ask about how you place the outside infrastructural support that came to make this possible.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think you're absolutely right. I think if to the Endilon is the sort of outside force that mattered to the story, and they were really kind of behind the scenes, but it's my understanding, and supporting Salvador Reza, who's a main figure in the book, and they were also involved in one of the key lawsuits against Arpaio, and they were also one of the real turning points in the publicity campaign. Endilon was very instrumental in raising the profile of what was going on in Arizona in 2009. So basically, 2009 is this transition period where Obama comes into office, and all of a sudden in Arizona, they have a Democratic administration for the first time in their fight against Arpaio, and they want to create national momentum and attention on this in the hopes that the Justice Department will investigate and that national media will pay attention. And I think through Endilon networks, there's a New York Times opinion writer who starts writing, Lawrence Downs starts writing op-eds or opinion pieces about what's happening in Arizona under Arpaio. Also, Endilon helps coordinate for there to be a Judiciary Committee hearing on 287G, which features witnesses who talk about Arizona. That ends up being a precursor to the Justice Department announcing that they will investigate Arpaio's office. And so we see Endilon playing this really important supportive role, kind of being this like DC savvy behind the scenes, helping the activists on the ground. And to speak to your other point about 2006, we see that as a turning point as well. The national wave of immigrant rights marches in response to the Sensenbrenner bill that happened nationally in Arizona and Phoenix, it ends up being this real coming together of all these different groups that were doing different things and hadn't necessarily been focused on immigration, but they all come together and form a new coalition, which they call Somos America, after the name of the national coalition for that march. And that group sticks together and winds up kind of putting their focus on Arpaio after that march. And they actually end up, Somos America is a plaintiff in both the Melendrez case, as well as the case challenging the human smuggling policy that allowed Arpaio to arrest migrants for smuggling themselves. And that's one of the first things that Somos America does as a new coalition working on the ground. And what's interesting is, I think your reflection that earlier on, some of these same activists weren't interested in immigrant issues, and then there was a turning point. I think for them, they also felt that they were, people like Danny Ortega felt like the rest of the community wasn't necessary, the rest of Latino leadership or other Latino community members weren't as early to join the immigrant rights push, that there was a lag there. I think in his mind, he thinks that it took a few years for them to see things really ramping up with Senate Bill 1070 and other factors for it to feel, the feeling to be more widespread that this is an issue that impacts us all. It's not only an immigrant issue. But that sensibility was something that he and Lydia Guzman and Alfredo Gutierrez really had in common, that they were born in this country and kind of immediately identified and saw their fate as linked to the undocumented community as well.
Okay. Terry, do you want to pick up on anything?
No, I'm just looking at these awesome questions in the Q&A.
Okay, so let's start with them. Why don't we do that, and then we can come back. So let me read the first question so the entire audience can see. Do you know if Arpaio was also, this is from Angela Salazar, do you know if Arpaio was also using the Phoenix Police Department to help with his initiative? Was there any investigation into it? I remember seeing sheriffs in West Phoenix doing sweeps in housing complexes in the early 2000s.
That's a really wonderful question. Arpaio, as Maricopa County Sheriff, first of all, for those of you who don't know Maricopa County, it is the state's most populous county, and it is basically Phoenix and the suburbs and then some unincorporated areas. So Arpaio, as Maricopa County Sheriff, had the authority by law, by Arizona law, to be able to police the entire county. So if you saw him one place, where they already had a police department, that doesn't necessarily mean he was working with those police. He might have, but he also had the authority to go any place he wanted. And he generally went, sometimes it turned out in court that he went where his tipsters suggested he go. This early sweep, I remember in my research, and it's not in the book, but in the early 2000s, Arpaio did a massive sweep, not to enforce immigration, but to arrest people in connection with tail lights going out, so, some sort of minor driving infraction. And that got his stats up, but it was also in a Latino neighborhood. And I remember that the county attorney got really mad at him for it, and he sort of held back after that. So I think that might have been what you saw. And I'm sorry that you had to see it.
I think what's also interesting to note is that because Arpaio had so many different kinds of tactics and was going after immigrants so specifically, that's where a lot of the organizing was against him. There was also organizing against Phoenix Police Department because they also had some policies about coordination with ICE. We didn't include that in the scope of our book because we had sort of too much to cram in, but it certainly, Maricopa County Sheriff's Office was not the only law enforcement agency that was also enforcing immigration, or this kind of more backdoor immigration, as Amada called it. And so there was a long-term issue with Phoenix PD as well. And when people like Lydia Guzman and others were looking for plaintiffs in this lawsuit, sometimes they would talk to people who had an experience that they felt was racial profiling, and then they would find out that it was a different law enforcement agency. It wasn't the sheriff's office. So it isn't to say that, this issue of driving while brown, people feeling targeted, did not start with Arpaio, and it sadly won't end with Arpaio. It was happening simultaneous and for decades and decades before these sweeps as well.
Okay, thank you. So now a question from Magali Larson. Congratulations for this book. I'm interested in knowing about the Hispanic resistance and I'm also curious about the actions and positions of the native Hispanic Arizonians, for we should not forget that this was land which belonged to Mexico, as did its people. Can you talk a little bit more about the expansion and dynamics of the Hispanic resistance today?
Jude, you want that one?
Sure. So hello, Magali. And the fact that this land was Mexico is something that we get into in this book, because we think that you can't really talk about this history without that context and the long history of discrimination and disenfranchisement that's happened to Mexican Americans in Arizona is a big piece of the context here. And I think that in terms of the resistance today, I mean, a lot of the people that we introduced you to in the presentation, who are the older generation of activists who are involved in the fight against Arpaio, have passed the baton. And there's a younger generation of people in their 20s and 30s, dreamers in Arizona, have been politically active here and have been organizing since they were teenagers, as well as some of their allies. And so there's a very dynamic group of people who are now in their 20s and 30s and have 10 to 15 years of organizing experience because of the era that they grew up in. Some of them, like Carlos Garcia, are now running for political office, and he's now in the Phoenix City Council. Raquel Terran is another activist who came out of the movement, who is now the head of the Arizona Democratic Party and is a state legislator. And so we're seeing a new generation rise, both on the organizing side and on the elected official side. And they're taking on a range of issues. Things like things that include workers' rights, as well as unconstitutional policing beyond the immigration context.
Okay, thank you. So now a question from Barbara Miller. The fight of policing is not over with the 2020 election. Arizona is not blue like California. There was a pivot to voter suppression with the Trump Republican control of the state government as they attempt to control the election process itself. Are these activists against police action turning their attention to the fight against voter suppression?
Barbara, thank you so much for that question. And you are so right. Arizona squeaked into blue just barely with just, Biden didn't win by a lot. And we have two Democratic senators who are often accused of being mainstream Republican senators for some of their stances. So you're right. Arizona is not blue like California. We do have a very strong and active Indigenous vote, and we have a very strong and active Latino vote, and we have, more as Phoenix grows, the urban areas become purpler and purpler in the Phoenix area. Now, about what's going on right now with Trump loyalists and the county election, I have not followed that super closely, except for what I read in the papers. I haven't reported on it, but I know that certainly there are activists who are, Latino activists who are extremely concerned about this. And it's interesting because I think that as the movement goes forward, there are lots of opportunities for intersectionality now that we're in a time of reckoning, and there are so many non-Latinos and Arizonans who are not of color who want to join in this movement and offer their support. So that's a very long-winded way of saying some in the movement are definitely concerned and involved with the fight against voter suppression, and hopefully the movement will only grow and grow. And yes, it should be their attention. You are right, Barbara.
And I could just add that, to be specific, Lydia Guzman, who is featured as one of the main figures in the book, she personally is, her next big push that she'll be working on is redistricting, which ties directly into some of these issues.
Okay, terrific. I think that this brings the questions to an end. I don't know whether I'm invite any further questions from the audience. Another few seconds. But if not, then why don't we bring the session to a close? I want to thank Terry and Jude for this terrific presentation. Congratulations on your book. It's clearly going to attract a wide readership. Thanks to Amada for a very stimulating comment, and thanks again for everyone for joining us this afternoon. In closing, I just want to remind you that we have another session next Friday at 12, featuring a book by Julie Kleinman, Adventure Capital, Migration and the Making of an African Hub in Paris. Okay, everyone, have a good weekend and hope to see you next Friday. Okay, and thanks again, Terry, Jude, and Amada. Bye-bye.